Hello! Welcome to another video, and today, as you can tell from the title and the thumbnail, etc., we are doing my June wrap-up. Now, June was not quite as good as July for me, unfortunately, but it was still an okay reading month. And there was only one book on TBR Pursuit that I didn't manage to read, but I did manage to read, I think, 4 books that weren't on TBR Pursuit, so it worked out alright. It was an okay month, but let's just fly through my stats quickly. So I've got my core pile spreadsheet up on my laptop as usual. So in the month of June I read 11 books, which is not my worst. Obviously compared to May's 19 it's a little bit less, but 11 is still pretty good for me considering prior to this year and lockdown situations, like 12 was the most I'd ever been able to do, so 11's pretty good. And the page count was 3,613, so not bad. I'm okay with that. Before we go into the books that I have read and what I thought of them, etc., I do want to use this little segment in my wrap-up to say thank you to all of my patrons. I started up a Patreon recently and I am shocked by how many people have signed up to that, so thank you very much to those people. And as part of the benefits of the furniture tier upwards, my tiers on Patreon are like friends, family, furniture and artwork, so we like make up a household. But my furniture tiers and above get a little shout out in a video, and I'm going to use my wrap-ups as my platform to do that. So here is a special thank you to Molly, Ali, Olivia, Nina, Maura and Kat, Emily, Becca and Ashley, Chris, Malotzi, Marlena and Kitty. Thank you very much guys for your support. I appreciate it so much. And yeah, thank you to the rest of my patrons as well. It's blown my mind, so thank you to that. And if you're not familiar with my Patreon or you want to check it out at all, there will be a link for it down below. But still no pressure, because I still feel weird about it. But it's there. Okay, thank you. Right, let's get on with the wrap-up. Of course, early in June, we all witnessed some horrific things happening in the world, sparking a resurgence and a real revolution with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that inspired a lot of my early reading in June. There was a lot going on and a lot that I realised I'm uneducated on, and a lot of people were promoting these non-fiction books to give us a better understanding, and I think it's really important that we do that, not just in June, but like continuously, and it's still important that we all pay attention to the Black Lives Matter movement. Just because the timeline on Twitter has gone back to normal, it doesn't mean that those things are not still ongoing issues, and the protests are still happening. Don't turn a blind eye to that. It is still happening, and the Black Lives Matter movement is still very important. I just want to preface that because a few of the books I read were related to that, and I feel it's important that I continue to educate myself. That being said, the first book that I read in June was Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo Lodge. As a white British person, I think this book was incredibly important for me to read as it focuses heavily on racism in Britain, and I think that really highlighted to me how little we are taught about the racist history of our country in British schools and in the British education system. We're taught a lot more about American history and the civil rights movement over there than we are ever taught about what happened in our own history, and I don't think that's quite right. It baffles me, but I'm really glad that I read Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, because it really opened my eyes to the fact that Britain, although we know it's not innocent, like, we think that Britain is so much better than America in terms of racism, and we're not. And I think that really highlighted that. I actually got my mum to read this book as well, so it sparked some important conversations between us as well. So I'm really grateful that I read this book. I don't really want to rate non-fiction books because I have not read enough of them to understand how to rate them. I assume it would be in terms of like how much information it gave me and how that information was presented, but I haven't read enough of them to rate them accurately. So I think I just popped all of my non-fiction books in Goodreads as like 4 stars, but I can't core pile them, so I don't necessarily have a rating for it, but I'm very glad that I did read Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And if you are a British person that wants to learn more about racism in Britain. I would completely recommend it. I'm sure there are plenty of other texts out there as well, but as the one that I've read, I think it was a very well presented book. Next up, I read Maya and the Rising Dark by Raina Barron. This I got an e-arc of on NetGalley and got around to reading it in June, and I'm very glad that I did. This one comes out on the 22nd of September this year, so not too far away. I quite enjoyed this one. It's about a young girl called Maya whose father is taken or goes missing, and she kind of takes it upon herself to find him. And she gets wrapped up in the world of the Orishas and all sorts of mythical and magical beings, and the difference between her world and the barrier into like the world of the darkness. I quite enjoyed it. It was very reminiscent of Percy Jackson to me in the way it was told. It was quite humorous and the structure of it was fairly similar. The way the chapters were titled, it was really easy and absorbing to read, and I did thoroughly enjoy my time with it. In terms of core pile, it got 6s and 7s across the board, which came out at a high 3-star. I gave it 7 for characters, 7 for atmosphere, 6 for writing, 7 for plot, 7 for intrigue, 6 for logic, and 7 for enjoyment. But it was definitely a nice, fun, light-hearted read with a great sense of adventure. I enjoyed and would recommend. If you're a fan of middle grade, then I think it's one that you can't really miss out on. Next up, I read Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. I read this for the catch-up book club that I am now a co-host of, so thanks Becca for inviting me along to that. This is the second book in the Farseer trilogy, which follows a young boy called Fitz, who is the bastard son of the prince, and when the prince discovers his bastard son, he abdicates the throne and runs away to the country, leaving Fitz in the care of the stable hand. Fabulous parenting, right? Fitz is then in a very unique political position because he has royal blood, but he's also a bastard son, so he's in the perfect place to mingle between the royals and the peasants, and the king utilises that and trains him up as an assassin. This is obviously the second book. We're following Fitz into adolescence at this point. He has a bit of a romance story going on, but there's also so much more, and we see a lot more of the magic in this one. There is the wit and the skill, and the skill is like this sort of like mind magic, and the wit is communication and connection with animals and how they interweave. I enjoyed this one a lot. I will admit I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I was going to enjoy it, because I thought after the first book that this one would get a 5-star from me. It didn't. It came out at a 4-star. It got 8s and 9s across the board on core pile, so it was definitely a high 4-star, but it just didn't quite hit that 5-star mark for me, unfortunately, and I'm really hoping the third one can, because I've come a long way with this series now. I mean, I'm only 2 books in, but I feel like I've got to know the characters a lot, and I care about them a fair bit, and I should be at that 5-star mark, so fingers crossed book 3 can do that for me. But this one got a 9 for characters, a 9 for atmosphere, a 9 for writing, and an 8 for plot, a 9 for intrigue, 9 for logic, and 9 for enjoyment. So it was pretty much 9s across the board, other than the 8 for plot, because it definitely had a plot aspect that I wasn't the biggest fan of in this one, but I won't tell you too much because I don't want to spoil it. But yeah, 4 stars for Royal Assassin. Next up, I read Dark Whispers by Vashti Hardy. This is the sequel to Brightstorm, which I read the month before and absolutely adored, so I went into this one highly anticipating that I would love it as well, and I did. The first book follows Arthur and Maudie when they are told that their father has perished on an expedition to South Polaris. However, they do not quite believe all of the evidence that they have been given and take it upon themselves to journey to South Polaris to find out the truth. This is the sequel, and Arthur and Maudie are going to the east, I believe, for this one, but they're on an expedition to find a missing explorer, and they discover a lot more than they set out to discover. The atmosphere in these books is fantastic. I've grown to love Arthur and Maudie, and just the sense of adventure and how mystical and wonderful and adventurous and wild it is. I love it, so this one got a 5-star from me as well. In terms of core pile, it got a 9 for characters, it got a 10 for atmosphere. I really think the atmosphere in these books is outstanding. A 9 for writing, a 9 for plot, a 9 for intrigue, an 8 for logic, and a 9 for enjoyment. So just a little bit lower on that logic mark to get it 8s and 9s and a 10 across the board. So I really recommend this series. If you like adventurous middle grades, you can't go wrong, and I definitely think you have to read The Bright Storm Adventures by Ashley Hardy. They come highly recommended from me. Next up, I read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. This is a book written by a white woman focusing on white fragility and how white people weaponize their whiteness and the way we're so fragile about our race and how we act like victims, and we're ignorant and we use our whiteness as a mask to this ignorance, and because things don't affect us personally, we ignore them, and then when we're confronted with them, we give back white fragility. I think it was a really interesting read. It's another one that I've spoken to my mum about as well. Me and my mum talk a lot about what we read, but I think it's a really insightful read that a lot of white people could benefit from, to see the arguments that they make be deconstructed by a white woman. And I like the way she started the book by saying, like, I'm coming at you as a white woman to tell you that you are racist, and you might think that you're not racist because racism is, you know, a polar scale, like you're either a bad person and a racist or a good person and not a racist. But there's so much more in between that. So yeah, she comes at you saying, I am a white person telling you as a white person that you are racist so that you listen to me, because when black people tell you you're racist, you go into defense mode and project your white fragility. But again, as a non-fiction, I didn't rate it. I can't rate it. I think I'd still put it down as like a 4-star just because you have to give it a star rating in Goodreads. I then followed that up with White Rage by Carol Anderson, which is much more of a historical book, and I think the 3 books that I read on racism this month very well go hand in hand, because White Rage is then the like topic that I've missed from the other 2, being American history and how the world got to the point that it is at, how racism evolved from what it was originally to modern day, where it's not gone. We can all acknowledge it's not gone, but how it's disguised itself as other things, how the vocabulary and the language has changed, but how it's still very much present. But yeah, White Rage gives us the history lesson along with that. There's a lot of American politics in there, so a lot of things that I probably wouldn't understand very much. There's a lot to take in from that book. It's probably the sort of book that you could do with reading multiple times because it's a lot of information to take in. However, I did notice with this one that it goes into a lot deeper detail than I was taught at school, but it's topics that I definitely remember being mentioned at school, which highlights what I said before when I was talking about Rennie Edo-Lodge's book, in that we're taught a lot more about American history than we are British history in Britain. But I really think of those 3 books, so White Rage, White Fragility, and Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, they come very well as a package, and I think if you're gonna read one of them, you should read all 3, because then you've got the British approach, the American approach, and then the less historical but personal approach of White Fragility as well. So it comes at it from a lot of angles and gives you a lot of information, so I think it was a good choice of books to read, and I'm very glad that I did. But again, with White Rage, I didn't rate it. I can't rate a non-fiction book. So yeah, but I'm glad that I read it for sure. Next up, I read The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. This was a beautiful book. This is a middle grade about a young girl who is raised by a witch in the town called the Protectorate. Yeah, in the Protectorate, every year they sacrifice the youngest baby in the town to the witch, this mystical witch who demands the sacrifice of a baby every year or she will ruin the town. So they sacrifice this little girl. And the witch comes along and picks her up and is confused every year as to why this town abandons a baby. So she picks up this baby, she takes it along, and usually she feeds the children Starlight and gives them on to a family that she knows will love and care for them. This particular child, she accidentally feeds moonlight, and everyone knows moonlight is magic. So she infuses this baby with magic and therefore has to raise it as her own. She names it Luna. This child grows up and grows into her magic, and stuff happens. This was honestly a really, really beautiful story, and if you're a fan of middle grade, I think you should read it because it's just fantastic. I found myself at points with this because it was just so beautiful and emotional. I was reading it and crying. Not like ugly crying, like something really sad's happened that's made me cry. Like, I was just reading it and just had tears whilst I was reading it, but like I didn't even notice. It was just making me emotional. And then towards the end I did actually ugly cry about it, so it was a very beautiful, very emotional read that I seriously recommend. Putting it through Core Pile, it surprised me because it didn't get 5 stars, which I really thought it would because it made me cry. It was beautiful and really emotional, but it came out at a high 4 star. So I gave it an 8 for characters, a 9 for atmosphere, very strong atmosphere, a 9 for writing, beautiful, just made me cry, 8 for plot, 8 for intrigue, 8 for logic, and 9 for enjoyment. So it came out at a very high 4 star, and I really recommend this. It's just so beautiful and immersive and heart-wrenching, and as I say, it made me cry. Next up, I read The Tombs of Aswan by Ursula K. Le Guin. I have been making my way through the Earthsea series for the Le Guin Along, hosted by Ashley at Frolic Through Fiction, and I need to read The Tombs of Aswan and The Furthest Shore, but didn't quite get to that one in June, for the next live show. The Tombs of Aswan follows a young girl called Aha, who is raised as the first priestess, the one priestess. She is the priestess of the Tombs of Aswan, where they worship the Nameless One. It's all very questionable, very dark. The Nameless One is basically, in their eyes, like the god of darkness and death and destruction, and they make sacrifices to it and have to please it, and the priestess goes down into the tombs where it all has to be dark and there's treasure in the tomb somewhere. And of course, because it's an Earthsea book, Ged shows up, who is the best magician ever, and basically convinces Aha of how incredibly strange her life is and what she worships shouldn't be worshipped, and the way she's been raised is not the life she should have had. I thought when reading it that I liked The Tombs of Aswan more than I liked A Wizard of Earthsea, but according to my Core Pile rating, that's not the case. So I gave it a 7 for characters, a 6 for atmosphere, a 6 for writing, a 5 for plot, a 4 for intrigue, a 5 for logic, and a 5 for enjoyment, which brings it out at a 3 star overall. What I'm finding with these books, I know it's only the second one, but like, I don't quite get it, because I've heard so many people say that these are the best books, these are like the peak of incredible fantasy, everyone should read the Earthseed cycle, it's fantastic, you'll love it, and I'm just not. I'm finding them very meh. Like, I don't love them, I don't hate them, and I feel like I have very little to say about them other than, yeah, I read it, and that is the extent of my opinion. I mean, I liked the darkness in The Tombs of Aswan, and there were definitely a couple of bits that I did have thoughts on. I won't say what for spoilery purposes, but I don't have any strong opinions, and I think that's going to make it quite difficult to talk about. It got a 3 star overall, and I feel quite indifferent about it. Next up, I read Murder Most Unladylike by Robin Stevens. I have tabs in this one. I read this one for Middle Grade Monthly. It was our June pick. There is a live show all about it on my channel somewhere. And this is not one I feel indifferent about. I didn't like this at all. And I feel really bad about it because a lot of people were excited about us picking this, and it's a lot of people's favourites and they absolutely love it, and the whole live show was basically me trash talking it. I didn't like it. It's about a couple of girls, Daisy and Hazel, who go to this all-girls boarding school, and one of them finds a dead body of one of the teachers in the gym. She goes to tell her other friend, they come back, and the body's gone. So not only do they have a murder to solve, they have to prove that the murder happened in the first place. And that sounds like a setup for a great story, but there was so much about this book that was incredibly problematic to me. The friendships were so incredibly toxic. The way Hazel is treated in this school is so awful, and it wasn't something I could look past. Like, if it was awful treatment that had consequences for actions and taught a lesson, then perhaps. But it really did not do that, and they never addressed that the way that Hazel was treated was wrong. There was so much bullying, it was just awful. So Hazel is Chinese, and people may argue that this is supposed to be set in the 1930s, so it would be accurate for the time for her to be a bit out of the ordinary being a Chinese student in a British all-girls boarding school. But there was very little in this book that actually suggested that time zone other than perhaps how they spoke. Like, everything was spiffing. Just the racist behaviour towards Hazel was never addressed. There was never any consequence for the way people treated her or the way people spoke to her, and I don't think that that's a good message in a children's book. I was waiting whilst reading it for someone to have some sort of consequence for the way they spoke to her, and it never happened. So it just made me uncomfortable, it made me angry, I didn't like it. In terms of core pile, it got a 4 for characters, a 5 for atmosphere, a 4 for writing, a 3 for plot, a 3 for intrigue, a 3 for logic, a 4 for enjoyment, and got a 2-star overall. I won't say too much about the mystery plot, but the big plot reveal of who done it was not a surprise to me at all. Admittedly, it's a middle grade, so maybe I'm just too smart for that, I don't know. But I won't be continuing with the series. I'm glad that it's done with, because I will not be going back to this one. Next up, I read The King's Letters by Sebastian de Castell. This is a 35-page ebook that is just a little extra for the Greatcoats. And I'm not ashamed to say that I gave a 35-page ebook 5 stars. If a 35-page ebook can make me cry within 4 pages, it deserves 5 stars. So The King's Letters is definitely something you should read after reading all of the Greatcoats, in my opinion, because it is King Paelus's last letters before he is murdered. Not a spoiler, the first book starts after he's been murdered, but it's his last letters to his Greatcoats, his final thoughts, his final words, the last thing he ever wants to say to these great men. And after reading the whole series of the Greatcoats, I know the things to which Paelus is referring, and what he's talking about, and it's just heartbreaking. So I gave it 5 stars. Core pile wise, I just gave it 9s across the board. Because it just needed to get 5 stars. It's not the sort of book that necessarily has a plot, but other than plot, characters, atmosphere, writing, intrigue, logic, enjoyment, all there. And I mean, if I include the external plot of why that book was written, then 9s across the board. Gave it a 5 star. Love it. If you've read all of the Greatcoats and you haven't read The King's Letters, I think you should. And finally, the last thing I read in the month of June was The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, and I'm very happy that I managed to finally squeeze this one in just at the end. So this book follows Vin and Kelsia, who are in on a plot to overthrow the Final Empire. The Final Empire is ruled by the Dark Lord, the Lord Ruler. He is this god, this unbeatable creature who accomplished something in his past that has made him this unbeatable, immortal god. But living situations aren't all that great. And in the Final Empire, there are people called Mistborn who can ingest metals that give them certain powers. So that is the magic system we've got going on in here. Incredibly logical, fact-based magic system, which I really appreciated. It was a little bit complicated in the beginning, but I learned to understand it. So we have a revolution plotline, basically, with these Mistborn allomantic powers. It got political, which I really liked. It was action-packed, which I really liked. I had a really good time with this, basically. Vin reminds me very much of Lila, who is one of my favourite characters ever, so I immediately latched onto Vin and just really, really enjoyed her character. So much about this is so well done, and something about Brandon Sanderson, I always felt very apprehensive about reading his books because they're chunky and they're held up to such a high standard and everyone loves them, and I've always felt a little bit like, they're scary, I'm scared of it, what if it's too much for me and I don't get it? But that's not the case. Brandon Sanderson's writing is very easily accessible, like, it's not dense, it's not hard to read, and when you're in the writing, it's so easy to just fly through, and that's definitely what I found myself doing. However, I did find myself struggling to pick it back up sometimes, but once I had, I could quite easily fly through it. In terms of core pile, it got a 9 for characters, a 9 for atmosphere, a 10 for writing, 9 for plot, 8 for intrigue, 9 for logic, and 9 for enjoyment, which gives it a 5-star rating overall, but it is only just a 5-star, so you know, room for improvement. But it did get a 5-star, and I'm very glad that I read it and finally have taken the plunge into the Mistborn trilogy. I am excited about seeing what is next in this series because I really liked the way this ended, and I'm not feeling very, like, eager for the sequel. Like, there wasn't a cliffhanger at the end of this that has me, like, desperate for the sequel. I think it ended quite wholly, quite fully, so I'm definitely intrigued to see what the next book is all about and what happens in that one. But I had a really good time with this, and I'm really glad that I read it. That is then everything that I read in June, so not a terrible reading month at all. I'm pretty happy with that. Fingers crossed I can do better for July though, like, I don't know. Maybe not book-wise, but perhaps page number-wise, because I've got a few chunky books on my July TBR. If you haven't seen that, TBR Pursuit is up somewhere. I hope you have enjoyed hearing my thoughts on these books. If you have read any of them and would like to talk to me about them, then please do so down below, but otherwise give us a thumbs up. If you aren't subscribed and fancy subscribing, I'm always eternally grateful for that. But yeah, I will see you in the next one.